The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody.
We have a bit of quick housekeeping tonight before we get into tonight's episode. We want to thank each and every one of you for supporting our show by listening to us each week. It really does mean a lot to Beth and I. And as you know, we don't run ads during our episodes. And so you might be wondering how you can support our show in other ways. We do have multiple ways for you to do that. First, you can check out our merch on our TeePublic store.
We have several design options featuring different versions of our logo that you can get on all kinds of items, from tote bags to pillows to mugs and clothing apparel.
And I have to say, they're really good quality because we've ordered some of our own merch ourselves.
We have, and we were very happy with, like you said, what good quality it is.
So all you have to do is go to our website, whereourmindswander.com, and click on our store link at the top of the page.
And while you're at our website, we have a couple other options we want to point out. We also have an Our Books section where you can purchase our 13 Creepy Urban Legends book and my young adult science fiction novel, Project Earth.
Yeah, and I just got to say that the 13 Creepy Urban Legends book really did well at the Sasquatch Festival in Whitehall, New York. I mean, parents and grandparents were just snatching them right up. We could have brought 50 books with us and we would have still been sold out by a couple hours in.
Yeah, they sold out really fast.
I was amazed.
Yep. And if you're looking for more episodes to listen to during the week, we also offer some pretty awesome premium bonus episodes that you can download for just $3 a piece.
Yeah, we priced them really cheap, so everybody would be able to afford them.
Yes.
And last but not least, if money is a little tight, the best way you can support our show is by leaving a 5-star review and a comment. It's free to do, and it really makes a big difference for us. Each 5-star review that people leave brings us up higher on the list for recommended podcasts, and it lets other people out there know that we're worth listening to.
And as we said, we really do appreciate your support, and it means a lot to us, and it's definitely what keeps us going each week.
It really does. And I imagine there's a lot of people out there that listen to podcasts that are saying to themselves, well, why don't you just get sponsors like everyone else to help support your show? But to be honest with you, I can't recommend any products that I don't 100% believe in. I just can't do that to our listeners because money is tight. And I just don't want to say I use something every day when I honestly don't. I mean, we had one of our favorite podcasts that we used to listen to all the time that went on in the beginning about just how crappy their nights of sleep are. And then a little bit down the line, they're talking, you remember, Beth?
Yes.
Pushing the mattress and how they got the best sleep of their lives. I was like, not even 3 minutes ago, you were just saying how crappy you slept. So how can you do that to your listeners? Knowing that these beds are, almost $3,000, $4,000.
Right. That was important to us, that we didn't push things that we didn't actually use and believe in. So, I mean, we do fund our show ourselves, So, having your support in other ways would be very helpful.
That it would. So now that that's all out of the way, that's it for our housekeeping tonight. So let's get into tonight's story.
This one reminds me a little of the Yuba County 5 story that we covered a while back. There's lots of similarities, including that it's an unsolved mystery.
I love a good mystery.
This is a good one. Little Lava Lake and Big Lava Lake in Oregon's Deschutes National Forest formed almost 8,000 years ago when Mount Mazama erupted. The two lakes are separated by a little over half a mile of solidified lava, and Little Lava Lake sits at an elevation of 4,744 feet. The 1.6 million-acre Deschutes National Forest was established in 1908, and our story begins just 14 years later in 1922. At the time, businessman Alan Wilcoxon was building Elk Lodge, a resort hotel on Elk Lake, and a logging contractor named Ed Logan owned a fur trapping cabin at Little Lava Lake. Both men hired the same two men, whose names were Lee Collins and Ed Nichols, to do some fur trapping for them. Things seemed to be going okay until Lee Collins stole some money and furs from his employers, and he also stole his trapping partner's, Ed Nichols' wallet. Nichols confronted him, and Collins threatened to kill him before skipping town. Turns out, Lee Collins was actually a man named Charles Kimsey, and Kimsey had several aliases besides Lee Collins. He also went by the names Tom Rose, Harry Walker, and John Doe Barry. A man with so many fake names was undoubtedly up to no good, and all three men, Nichols especially, were glad to be rid of him. They figured he was long gone with his stolen goods. A year later, in 1923, Ed Logan rehired Ed Nichols to watch over his fur trapping cabin on Little Lava Lake for another winter season. It was a lucrative but lonely business, and Nichols invited two acquaintances, 35-year-old Roy Wilson and 25-year-old Dewey Morris, to help him. Wilson and Morris worked for the Brooks Scanlon Lumber Company, and Nichols, who was 50 years old, was happy to have such good help, especially since Wilson was a former Marine. The three men, who were all from Bend, Oregon, settled in for the winter in the cabin, planning to stay from late fall until February of 1924, trapping animals and watching over the property. Part of the deal was that they were supposed to take care of 5 rather valuable foxes that Logan housed in a pen on his property. Nichols took this responsibility very seriously and diligently cared for the animals. According to Grunge.com, the men were pretty isolated up in their cabin. There weren't any campgrounds in the Deschutes National Forest and no official hiking trails. But the fur trapping was great. And a week before Christmas, Nichols was seen pulling a sled piled with furs into Bend in order to sell them. He spoke with several locals, all of whom said Nichols was in great spirits. He sold all of his furs and said that everything was going really well for him up at the cabin. He predicted that they would call it quits in February. Then he headed back, the 5 miles or so, to the cabin on foot, pulling the now empty sled behind him. On January 15th, Alan Wilcoxon decided to snowshoe the 30 miles or so from his home in Fall River to his resort on Elk Lake. He stopped over at the cabin by Little Lava Lake for the night and had a great time visiting with the 3 fur trappers. They had dinner together and sat around talking late into the night. All 4 of them were in high spirits when Wilcoxon continued on the following morning, according to DiscoverHubPages.com. Nichols told him that it was still the plan for the 3 of them to come back to Bend in February. As far as authorities could tell, sometime within the next 2 weeks, a triple homicide known as the Lava Lake Murders took place. To this day, 100 years later, it's still an unsolved case. Because when February came and went, the 3 trappers didn't show up in Bend. Then March went by. Thoroughly concerned, all 3 men's families began to wonder what had happened. No one had heard from them, and they feared that something was very wrong. According to CentralOregonDaily.com, on April 13th, Dewey Morris's brother, Innes Morris, and Roy Wilson's brother-in-law, as well as Pearl Linz, the superintendent of the Tumalo Fish Hatchery, made their way out to the cabin. Linz had noticed that several mink traps that the 3 trappers were responsible for hadn't been taken care of in a really long time, and he was just as concerned as the other 2 men. The first thing they noticed was a lack of footprints anywhere around the cabin, and that there wasn't any smoke coming from the chimney. It was April, but it was still chilly, with snow still on the ground. As soon as they opened the door, a very skinny and hungry cat came darting out. When they went inside, it was really eerie. There were pots filled with burnt food on the stove. Moldy food still sat untouched on dinner plates on the table, and the wall calendar was still on January. According to HistoricMysteries.com, all of their traps, winter clothing, and rifles were still there. It was as if time was frozen in place. The only missing item, as far as they could tell, was the sled that the men used to transport their furs. And the only thing out of place was a hammer, which appeared to have dried blood on the handle. Morris, Wilson's brother-in-law, and Linz didn't know what to think, but they knew that Nichols wouldn't let anything bad happen to Logan's prized foxes. So the 3 men walked immediately over to the fox pen. All 5 of them were gone. Knowing something was very, very wrong, the 3 men alerted the authorities, and within a day, Deschutes County Sheriff and former game warden Clarence Adams was on scene. 4 of the 5 foxes were found under a tree. 2 had been expertly skinned, and the other 2 were also skinned, but very badly. The trapping lines, according to DiscoverHubPages.com, were filled with the frozen remains of 12 martens, 4 foxes, and a skunk. What would cause Morris, Nichols, and Wilson to abandon their traps, skin their employer's prized foxes, and then leave the cabin so quickly that they left all of their belongings behind in the middle of winter? Authorities had no idea, but when they discovered that not all of the men's guns were left behind, of the 7 known weapons carried by the men, only 5 were still in the cabin. The Colt revolver and a Luger automatic pistol were missing. They had their first clue that the men may not have left the cabin willingly. And when they discovered pools of blood along the lakeside trail and a human tooth, they suspected murder. Their missing sled was discovered right near Big Lava Lake, and it appeared to have bloodstains on it. And even more chilling was the hole cut into the lake ice. When the lake thawed, Nichols, Morris, and Wilson's bodies were found. According to DiscoverHubPages.com, Nichols owned 2 pairs of glasses, and when he was found, he was wearing the pair he only wore at home, inside the house, leading investigators to assume that he hadn't planned on leaving the cabin. His watch was stopped at 9:10. According to TillamookHeadlightHerald.com, all 3 men had died from gunshot wounds and blunt force trauma. Descriptions of their wounds vary slightly, depending on the source, and the descriptions are quite brutal, so if you'd rather not hear them, you might want to step away for a minute. Essentially, Ed Nichols suffered a shotgun blast to his face and chest, and then a revolver shot to the head, execution style. Roy Wilson had been hit by a shotgun blast in either the right shoulder or right elbow, and then also shot execution style. Morris had been shot in the left arm and then bludgeoned in the head with the hammer. Putting it all together, authorities were pretty confident that 2 men had murdered the trappers, based on the 2 distinctly different skill levels at skinning Logan's foxes, and based on the 2 different guns that were used, and how one seemed to have had much better aim. Sheriff Adams certainly believed this was the case, and now he had 2 murderers to track down. But who could they possibly be, and why would they have attacked the trappers? We'll try to answer that after this quick break. Hey, did you know? In a post-apocalyptic world devoid of all humans, one species could possibly rise up as the next dominant one. No, it's not apes, as you might expect. They, according to Oxford researcher Tim Coulson, would undoubtedly die out like humans. Coulson believes the new dominant species on Earth would be octopuses. Octopuses already use tools, camouflage, problem-solving skills, and communication. They live in sophisticated societies, and some already venture on land for brief periods of time. Add their incredible anatomy and dexterity, and they are a true contender for world domination. Who'da thunk it?
All right, and we are back. The first few leads in the Lava Lake murder case didn't lead police anywhere. There was a report of 2 men passing through the area earlier in the winter who were suspected of breaking into a cabin owned by a man named Casey Jones. The break-in occurred about 20 miles from Lava Lake, and Jones only reported that his cabin had been broken into. He never saw either man, only their footprints in the snow heading to and from his cabin. Then there was a suspicious tall, dark-haired foreigner who locals said came into a logging camp with a sack and a gun and asked for directions to Lava Lake. Why they considered him suspicious, or why asking for directions to the lake stuck in their minds, I have no clue. Their first actual suspect was a moonshiner and a woodsman named Indian Erickson. Erickson was camping at nearby Cultus Lake, about 7 miles from Logan's cabin. Now, I tried to find more details about why they suspected him, or even a little more about who he was, but unfortunately, as the case is sometimes, I couldn't find anything. Erickson provided a solid alibi, and police ruled him out. But then they hit on a more solid lead. W.C. Bender, a traffic officer in Portland, Oregon, came forward and said that on January 22nd or 25th, depending on the source, a man approached him with a sack of furs, asking for directions to the nearest furrier. This man said that his name was Nichols and showed the officer Ed Nichols' trapping license. Bender pointed him towards Schumacher Fur Company. The owner of Schumacher's Fur Company said 2 men entered his store. One was quite friendly and boisterous. The other, who was carrying the sack of furs, was sullen and quiet. He dropped the sack of furs on the floor and left the store. The chatty one said that they were both from Bend and that they had had a great trapping season. The owner paid him $110 for the furs, and the man left. According to the descriptions of both men, the Deschutes County Police believed that the sullen and quiet man who claimed to be Ed Nichols was actually Charles Kimsey, the man with many aliases who had stolen from Wilcoxon and threatened Ed Nichols a year earlier. Kimsey was actually on the run at the time. To be more precise, he had been on the run after breaking out of an Idaho jail when he was partway through a 15-year sentence for burglary, when he had shown up in Lava Lake in 1922. And right before arriving in Oregon, he had tried to kill a cab driver named W.O. Harrison. For reasons unknown, about halfway through the car ride, while pulled over in the middle of nowhere so Kimsey could relieve himself, Kimsey had attacked the driver. He knocked Harrison out, bound his hands and feet with wire, and threw him down a well. Then he got into the car and drove off, leaving Harrison for dead. According to HistoricMysteries.com, Harrison was able to shimmy out of his restraints and climb out of the well. He made it to the nearest house and contacted the police. Kimsey was caught, but before he went to trial, he fled town. Wanted for attempted murder, Kimsey was still on the run in 1925 when he walked into Schumacher's Fur Company, if it was actually Kimsey at all. And it took 9 years for police to finally catch him. While walking down the street in Kalispell, Montana in 1932, one of Kimsey's former jailers from Idaho recognized him. He was immediately taken into custody. Already wanted for attempted murder, Kimsey had an alibi ready and waiting when he was asked about the Lava Lake murders. According to TillamookHeadlightHerald.com, he said, quote, "They think I killed those trappers, but I didn't. I was in Colorado working on the Moffat Tunnel at that time." He claimed not to know Morris, Wilson, or Nichols, which was untrue. He had worked with Nichols in 1922, and police couldn't confirm his alibi, which is interesting because some sources I looked at said that they couldn't confirm it while others said they actually did. But regardless, they didn't have enough evidence to bring him up on charges. They could have extradited him back to Idaho, but since he was wanted for various crimes in various other states as well, they decided to try him for the attempted murder of W.O. Harrison in Oregon. He received a life sentence and served 25 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. At that time, a life sentence for attempted murder was pretty rare, and Kimsey knew the life sentence was partially because law enforcement believed he had taken part in the Lava Lake murders. He used that as an argument in front of the parole board in 1957, saying all they had was circumstantial evidence and he hadn't done it, which is why the parole board released him after just 25 years. Kimsey, who was in his 70s at that time, returned to Idaho, where he lived out his remaining years. And that's why, 100 years later, the Lava Lake murders are still considered unsolved. Because if there were 2 men who worked together to commit the murders, and one of those men may or may not have been Charles Kimsey, then who was his accomplice? Was the chatty man who claimed to be Ed Nichols at Schumacher's Fur Company the accomplice, or just an acquaintance? The fact that Morris, Wilson, and Nichols left their cabin in the middle of breakfast and left all of their belongings behind stumped police. It was as if the men had been interrupted by someone who didn't seem threatening to them in any way. Remember, Nichols knew Kimsey and had been threatened by Kimsey, so it didn't make any sense that the 3 men would willingly go outside with him without some sort of fight. So, was this accomplice the one who knocked on their door and invited himself in, and then somehow lured them outside when Kimsey waited to ambush them? Since Kimsey denied ever knowing anything about the murders, he certainly never offered up any leads. According to TillamookHeadlightHerald.com, Lake County historian and crime author Melanie Tupper proposed her own theory in her 2013 book, The Trapper Murders. She suggests that Kimsey's accomplice was an associate of his, a schoolteacher named Ray Van Buren Jackson. According to OffbeatOregon.com, Jackson and Kimsey both had family ties and mutual friends. However, I wasn't able to find any specifics about what those family ties or who those mutual friends were. But Ray Van Buren Jackson had quite the reputation. Working as a schoolteacher in Silver Lake, Oregon in 1906, Jackson was known for his temper when his students displeased him. One story goes that one day after getting into a fistfight with one of his students, Jackson took out his .45 Colt revolver and placed it on his desk. He then nonchalantly asked if any of his students wanted to continue their argument with him. Whether they knew it or not, that Jackson had just been released from prison for embezzling and burglary before being hired as their teacher didn't really matter. No one continued the argument. As a child, Jackson was naturally left-handed, but since he had been forced to write with his right hand, he picked up quite the talent for forging signatures. It seemed that he was quite good at it, and he was wanted for forging signatures on a couple of banknotes. So throughout the late 1890s, Jackson bounced from teaching job to teaching job. Although his teaching certificate was legitimate, he didn't stay in one place for very long. He taught in Beaver Creek in Klamath Falls before he was finally caught and went to prison for 2 years. He was released in 1898, but found himself back in prison after committing a robbery. When he was released again, he made his way to Silver Lake, where he apparently got into fistfights with his students. He insisted that his students call him professor, even though he wasn't one, and he kept 2 buggy whips, a baseball bat, and a gun in his classroom as part of his classroom management. He boasted to the locals that he used the buggy whips on his students quite often, and he narrowly missed hitting a student in the head with a glass inkwell that he had thrown at them. Despite his aggressive discipline tactics, in 1908, Jackson was promoted to superintendent of the Lake County Schools. 2 years later, he was indicted for embezzling money from the school district and forced to resign in 1911. In her book, Melanie Tupper aims to prove that Ray Van Buren Jackson was involved in no less than 6 suspicious deaths, like that of John Creed Kahn in 1904. Kahn was a prominent businessman in Silver Lake. He was the owner of a lucrative mule team freight line. But he couldn't figure out what had happened to the proceeds of a $3,000 loan that had went missing from his bank account. Kahn had breakfast with local teacher Ray Van Buren Jackson one morning, and then went to fetch his mail and then disappeared. Kahn was found 7 weeks later, propped up against some rocks on a nearby cattle ranch. He had been shot with a gun, stolen from his own property, and his face had been beaten in so badly that he was almost unrecognizable. Even more strange, it appeared as though Kahn had been shot, had died, and then had been beaten and then shot again after he was left on the cattle ranch. Sounds a little familiar, right? Well, in a lot of ways, it is pretty similar to how the 3 fur trappers were killed. Afraid of bad publicity, authorities ruled Kahn's death a suicide. And that's how at least 5 other deaths played out that involved Jackson. Several were ruled suicides, even though they seemed very unlikely to have been self-inflicted wounds. Not long after Kahn's body was discovered, Jackson bought himself $3,000 worth of cattle. Although there is no definitive proof, Melanie Tupper does firmly believe that Jackson was Kimsey's accomplice. There's probably very little anyone could do to definitively prove it, though, since Jackson died 5 years after Kimsey was sent to the Oregon State Pen. Ironically, Jackson's own death was ruled a suicide, even though it was also highly suspicious. So, as I had said, the Lava Lake murders are still considered an unsolved mystery 100 years later. So, did Kimsey convince Jackson to help him get revenge on Nichols, or did Kimsey act alone? Did Kimsey even do it? Well, these are the questions that historians, both amateur and professional, are still asking. Unfortunately, though, it seems highly unlikely that we will ever know. And it seems like we say that quite a bit in a lot of these mysteries. But so much time has gone by that it is pretty unlikely that anyone's ever going to solve it.
Right. Because they don't even know 100% that Kimsey even did it.
I know.
He may not have done it. And so then there's two people out there, not one, that they still didn't get for it.
Right. Well, we always say we love a good mystery.
I know, but they frustrate me to no end, because you know I like to know the answers to things.
Well, yeah, we all like closure.
Right. It's a interesting story.
And frustrating.
Yeah. Sometimes those are the best kind, I guess.
Well, like we always say, check out our sources. There's much more to these stories that we can't possibly cover in one episode or two, possibly 3.
Yeah, and I'll say that when it came to Ray Van Buren Jackson, you had talked about one of the murders that he's kind of tied to. The site that we used as a source lists all the others as well. We didn't get into all the other ones that he was supposedly tied to. So if you're interested, you might want to check that out.
Yeah. Well, with that said, Beth, I think that wraps it up for this episode.
I think so.
Join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
And thank you all for your continued support.
See you next week for an all-new episode.